and she's from University College of London, and she will be speaking about the rules of relationships.
Thanks. Can you hear me now? Okay, good. I hope everyone's doing all right. I'm also quite happy that we're going straight to lunch because I'm desperate for the loo. So I will run through this as quickly as I can. Okay, so one sort of thing to note before we get started is a confession that I am not a neuroscientist, and I'm actually not also a psychologist. So I'm actually an evolutionary biologist, and that means that the way that I think about behavior is very much influenced by my perspective that humans are just one of many creatures on this planet that have figured out how to have a social life. And on this slide are a number of species that I have worked on as well in the past. So one common feature for all these kinds of species that have interactions with conspecifics is that they have to manage their relationships, and they have to figure out ways to to form and maintain mutually beneficial relationships. So how do they do this? And another thing we know about humans is that although we are, just one of these many social species on the planet, we are unusual in the sense that we don't only have relationships with one another, we also have relationships with non-human species like our pets, and sometimes we have relationships with brands as well. And what I'm going to argue today is that the kind of psychology we have for managing our interactions with brands is the same psychology we use for managing the interactions we have with other humans. So we don't have a specialized psychological machinery for our interactions with brands. And if we want to understand more about how people relate to brands and how they feel about the interactions that they have with them, we can learn a lot by thinking about how we interact with one another and how we manage the relationships we have with one another. Okay, so we have relationships, but obviously some relationships we have are better than others. In fact, some relationships, like this one, are bad. This is quite loud. Go down. So some relationships are bad. So this can select, in an evolutionary sense, for mechanisms that allow us to evaluate potential interaction partners and to use mechanisms that control our interaction partners in the context of the relationships we have to make sure that we don't end up being exploited in the way that this poor lady is. One of the first rules that people tend to use in relationships is reciprocity. So reciprocity is the golden rule of interactions. You might have heard of it as something like give and take. You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours, and so on and so forth. Now, a very simple view of how reciprocity works is based on a model that evolutionary biologists came up with, which is called tit for tat. Now, tit for tat is a very, very successful strategy for promoting cooperation. It simply cooperates in the first move, and then you do whatever your partner did. So if you cooperate with me, I'll cooperate back with you, and if you don't cooperate with me, I won't return the favor either. And there's a very nice example of this in the news at the moment with President Trump, who's being accused of trying to foster some kind of tit-for-tat relationship with the president of Ukraine by offering him military aid in exchange for investigating a political rival. Okay? So tit-for-tat is probably one quite common mechanism that we can use to control interaction partners in relationships. But imagine yourselves for a moment in this situation, okay? You've gone out for lunch with your friends, you're sat at the table, and the bill comes. Now, imagine how you might feel if your friend turns to you and says, well, I actually bought the lunch last time, so you need to pay for it today. That's tit for tat, okay? Most of us would feel extremely uncomfortable if we found ourselves in this situation, and we would feel probably annoyed with the friend that told us that it was our turn to pay. In fact, there are now apps that allow us to do this very easily. This one is called Venmo, where it allows users to invoice one another for small expenses that they have incurred or shared expenses. And these are just a handful of the kind of things that people do invoice one another for on Venmo. So things like 38 cents for my part in a shared jar of salsa. Over 3 million transactions in 2018 were for very sort of small amounts of money, less than $5. And there is a growing sense that these kinds of apps can somehow damage the fabric of our social relationships, and even people write papers on this kind of thing, okay? So the problem with tit for tat is that even it can be a very successful mechanism for promoting cooperation, but in the context of long-term established relationships, it simply doesn't work. It's a social mistake to insist on tit for tat, and it really only works well in the context of these computerized models. What we see in human friendships and what we see in long-term relationships in non-human species is that individuals have much more flexible patterns of exchange. So they don't insist on, I did something for you and now you have to pay me back straight away. It's a lot more flexible. It's not what we would call a strict bookkeeping mechanism of reciprocity. And here is one example that I think is particularly nice, which is from the Maasai, who are pastoralists who live in rural Kenya in Africa. And these Maasai people tend to define their relationships with other people according to the kind of friendship that they have. So for Maasai, they will have a small number of what they call osatua friends, which are a very small number of interaction partners with whom you have a form of need-based transfer. What that means is, with your osatua partners, if they ask you for something, you just give it to them, so long as it doesn't compromise your survival or your ability to make it through the dry season or something like this. And in return, when you're in need, you can ask your partner and they will also help you. Now, these kinds of osatua relationships are quite different to what the Maasai call their esau relationships, which is basically how they deal with everybody else, which is much more similar to this tit-for-tat kind of reciprocity, where you will help someone, but the expectation is that the favor will be repaid. Now, I want to make the point that when we get into relationships, if you'll allow, with brands, and when we perceive those as being long-term relationships, those might often come under this sort of, be much more similar to these osatua type friendships than to the esau relationships that the Maasai have. And that what that means is that if you're a brand and you treat your customer as if it was a kind of tit-for-tat relationship, that can actually go down very, very badly. And there's plenty of studies which have shown that brands which adopt a more human-like approach to their interactions with their customers, for example, by offering flexible returns policies, or allowing their frontline staff to be empowered to deal with consumer complaints at the time the complaint is happening, rather than having a textbook which says whether you can give a refund or not give a refund, often increases consumer trust in the brand, increases sales, and increases profitability. So these are some key insights from thinking about how reciprocity among human friends might also be helpfully applied to the relationships that we have with non-humans, including brands. Rule number 2 that I want to talk about is reputation. Okay, so when all of us have options, okay, when we think about who we want to interact with, commonly there will be a range of interaction partners to choose from, and that presents a problem because how do you actually pick the right person or the right brand to interact with? And one thing that we know that humans do pay a lot of attention to is reputation, and in particular reputation for being a pro-social or kind or helpful individual. Now, it might be that these signals, these reputation signals, might be helping to show some hidden quality about individuals that you interact with. And they might actually be what evolutionary biologists call costly signals. And I'll explain in a moment why that's important. So we know for sure that helping is costly. This is the UK politician, Ed Miliband, giving to charity. And people are also more likely to be helpful when they believe that they are observed. Okay, so helping does seem to have these signaling characteristics. What we know from nature, if you like, from non-human species, is that costly signals can be reliable indicators of hidden qualities, and it's the cost of those signals that bakes the reliability into them. So the classic example from evolutionary biology is the peacock's tail, this great big train that he carries around with him and has to shake in a particular manner in front of the female to catch the female's attention, is a massive, hugely costly ornament that has no function other than to attract a female. But nevertheless, it's a very effective signal because only the very best males can afford to carry these tails around, and the female therefore gains genetic benefits by mating with males with the largest tails. What happens when there's competition for partners is that you can get situations like peacock's tails, where it's no longer good enough to have a big tail, you have to have the biggest tail. So this competition for partners can lead to signal escalation. And we were interested in a study that I did some years ago now in whether helping behavior in humans might also be subject to this kind of escalation in the way that peacock's tails over evolutionary time have got bigger. Is it, if we're thinking of helping as a signal, can we find any evidence for helping signals escalating in this manner? So to test this, we used data from an online fundraising platform, which whereby people who are, for example, going to run the marathon or something like that, host a fundraising page where they have their photo. So you normally have a photo of the person who is trying to raise money. They tell you the charity they're raising for and the amount that they're hoping to raise. And then finally, and most importantly, all the donations that arrive on a page are both sequential and visible to new donors that arrive on the page. What that means is that donors can both see and respond to what previous donors have done before. And this creates what we called a potential generosity tournament, whereby donors might see what other people have given and might try to give a little bit more, might try to up the stakes, up the ante, and show off a tiny bit more than other people. Now, we didn't think that all donors would be doing this. Based on insights from evolutionary psychology, which I won't go into here, we thought that if we were going to see this competitive signalling, it was most likely going to be men that were doing it, and that they would be most likely to do it when they were giving on the pages of attractive female fundraisers. And that's basically exactly what we found. So this is just a graphical abstract. You can find the paper and read it if you want to see the real data. But what we found is that when men are responding to large donations that were made by other men, and when they're donating on the pages of the most attractive female fundraisers, they tend to give around £40 more on average relative to any of the other conditions that we tested. And so in some sense, it looks therefore like men are actually competing with one another on these fundraising pages, and they're competing in the manner that we would expect based on evolutionary predictions. They're competing to show off their generosity in front of a valuable or attractive audience. Why are they doing this? Well, we know there is a wealth of literature showing that people prefer to interact with pro-social partners, okay? So these are studies that have been done on hunter-gatherer populations, not by me. This is the Matu of Western Australia. These are the Arche of Paraguay. In the Matu society, it's the women who hunt. They hunt these big monitor lizards that you can see here by sticking their hand down a hole in the sand, fishing the lizard out, whacking it on the floor to kill it. And they'll catch maybe 6, 7 of these lizards in one hunting trip, bring them back to the camp, and then the lizards get shared among everybody else, regardless of whether they were on the hunt, regardless of who caught what. Now, in the Martu society, it's the most generous hunters and not the most skillful hunters who people say that they want to hang out with. I want to go hunting with the person who gives away most of what she catches, and I want her to be in my social network. Experimental work that I've done with my colleague Pat Barkley, where we brought these kinds of decisions into the lab, also supports this idea that when people are evaluating others for social interactions, they place a real premium on fairness and generosity, and that's much more important to people than signals of wealth or ability to give. So the insights here for companies are that if you can signal that you are a pro-social company or an ethical company, then your products might be perceived as being better quality, which is what some studies have shown. And also, one study that came out very recently found that ethical companies tend to receive more applicants per job, and when the people get the job, they're willing to work harder for a lower wage. So these kinds of signaling pro-sociality benefits can also have important benefits for companies as well. Okay, so the last rule that I want to tell you about is a kind of antidote to the reputation rule. So this is the rule of integrity. So part of the problem of being a human is that we are intuitive bullshit detectors. What that means is we don't always take actions at face value. We routinely look under the hood and try to infer the intentions or the motives behind what look like good actions on the surface, and we are acutely sensitive to self-interest. Okay, so in this respect, this is really now where we start to see humans and being quite different to any other species on the planet. Because we are these intuitive mind readers, what that means is that sometimes signaling that you are a pro-social individual can actually lead to reputation costs rather than reputation benefits. For example, if you consider this was a tweet that I just pulled off Twitter from a humble brag thread, this is the lady writes, "I just did something very selfless, but more importantly, it was genuine, and I know it means a lot to the person in the long run. Hashtag so worth it." So if your reaction to this might be similar to me, which is basically a bit of an eye roll. Okay, so when people see things like this, they kind of tend to take it with a massive pinch of salt, and we treat these claims of worthiness, self-reports of people's own worthiness with a healthy dose of skepticism. And this can actually lead to this insight for brands and also for people, which is known as the tainted altruism effect, which is when actions that produce charitable benefits and also personal benefits for the actor are evaluated as worse than actions that produce no charitable benefit. Okay, so this is a form of moral hypocrisy that we probably all are somewhat guilty of, but which can have very real-world consequences. So this is a very nice example of this. This is the clothing company Patagonia, who are very famous for their commitment to ethical products, to environmental goals, and things like this. And in this study, Patagonia had two different adverts, one of which was just the control advert, where it says, "Try on adventure," and a person doing something adventurous looking. And another kind of advert, which was an environmentally motivated advert, where the advert basically says, "Don't buy this jacket." So Patagonia want you to buy one thing once, and they want you to keep it forever. So they don't want you to keep buying new clothes from Patagonia all the time. Both of the adverts resulted in increased sales for Patagonia. So they both adverts were generated profits. But when you ask consumers, what do you think about the brand, now that you've seen these adverts and you know that they've generated profits, people are really not impressed by this advert that has a pro-environmental message, but that nevertheless results in a benefit for the company. In the context of charitable donations, what that means is that sometimes people might be likely to try to hide their good deeds. They might be try to donate, for example, anonymously, rather than leaving their name next to a donation. And that's, in a study that I ran, I found that people do that, and they do it exactly when you would expect. They do it when their donation is small, but they also donate anonymously when they're giving a very large donation relative to what's normal for that page. And perhaps this tainted altruism effect might be part and parcel of why people hide an action that could or might lead to reputation costs. Maybe these people might try to tell the fundraiser afterwards, well, it was me who left £200 on your page, or maybe they just hope in some way that they'll get found out without having signaled about it. And Oscar Wilde perhaps put it best when he said that the nicest feeling in the world is to do a good deed anonymously and have somebody find out. When we think about further insights, again, this is from an online fundraising platform, we can also think about how this sort of slight aversion to advertising our good deeds can actually be a hindrance in some senses to getting other people to donate. So this was some work that Just Giving, this online fundraising platform, did, and they knew that when people donated to a friend's fundraising page, if they then shared on Facebook that they had donated, the company had data to suggest that those shares were worth about £5 or £6 in average in terms of additional donations coming to the page of the fundraiser. So the company very much wanted people to share that they had donated to the friend, but most people didn't want to do this, probably because they felt like it was a bit sort of, a bit aggrandizing and a bit icky to tell people on your Facebook page that you've just given to charity. So Just Giving ran an intervention where they tried out a bunch of different messages to try to prompt people or nudge people to share the fact that they had donated on a friend's page. So I won't read all of these out, but I just want to highlight that the message which had the largest effect out of any of these 5 was one that said, help your friend raise even more money by sharing their page. So it's not, you're an amazing person, go and tell everyone all about it. When they phrased this as, help your friend to get more money for their fundraising page, they saw a 28% increase in the willingness to share and a projected £3 million increase in donations from just this kind of simple intervention, which allows people to share that they've done a good thing without feeling like they're showing off about it. Okay, so the main take-homes from this is that 3 important rules for relationships are reciprocity, reputation, and integrity. We need to remember that the psychological machinery we have in here has not evolved to deal with brands, and that sometimes the relationships we have with brands might make use of the machinery we have for managing relationships with other people. What that means for brands is that if you want to have productive interactions and relationships with customers, they should try to behave more like human friends would. And finally, pro-social actions can improve reputation, but sometimes there can be hidden costs if these are deemed to be self-interested. Thank you very much.
All right, that was excellent. I do want to take a small number of questions, if there are questions. I actually have a question myself. So if you put together some of what you said there, there's sort of a dark conclusion for the corporate world, which is the corporate world should stop trying to do anything good, because shareholders seem to mostly be happy with that approach because it comes back in a positive way and enhances the value of the company. But if it turns out it doesn't enhance the company because you get penalized for doing it, then the ultimate corporate response is stop doing it. which doesn't seem like the right thing overall. We want companies to do good because it is better for the world if they're doing that. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're probably, in some respects, I agree. I think from a corporate perspective, you can signal that you're doing good things, but the real risk comes in where the perception is that you're not applying those values across the board. So, for example, Shell, the oil and gas company Shell, has a different arm called Shell Foundation, which is its charitable arm, which is aimed at increasing, developing green forms of energy. And I think it's really difficult for Shell to gain a reputation benefit from having the Shell Foundation because it's just so obvious that that's a tiny part of their overall brand, and the overall brand is about basically pulling fossil fuels out of the ground. I think that there is more scope to have reputation benefits when it's something which is much more where the brand really lives by those values. So I think it's really about integrity in that sense. But I think I sort of know where you're coming from as well, that it does seem like you might as well do nothing because if you make a profit from it, people will just say they don't like it.
All right, are there any other live questions? Okay, I'm going to go to Slido, maybe the second one up there, which is when people recognize that this kind of generosity and competitive signaling is going on, does that cause people to just stay out of the equation altogether and say, I don't want to be anywhere near this? And again, that reduces the actual charitable giving that you would get as a result.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, but it's one that we really just can't test because the data we have are basically the data from the donation data from the fundraising pages. So we don't have any way to measure people who visited the page and then decided not to give. We just don't have any information about those people. So it could be that could well be a thing, but we haven't got data to test it.
Maybe we'll do one last one. The top question up there has to do with the idea of when it comes to brands, do we ever start out in that sort of more impersonal type of relationship, which you refer to as the asili?
Oh, the asili, yeah.
And does it then switch over?
I think it's an empirical question. Yeah. So I think, yes, probably that does happen, but I don't want to sort of vacillate like in a hand-wavy way. I think it's an empirical question. Okay.
Well, great. Thank you.
Okay.
And thanks again to all the speakers from this session. And I think now it is time for lunch. So go forth and eat.